Female CEO mocked black single dad's silence, then realized why elevator doors slid open on the 38th floor of Monarch Industries, and the cold air of power and money rushed out like an invisible wave. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting sharp light across marble floors that reflected the faces of everyone who walked upon them. This was the kingdom of Diane Crawford, a woman who had clawed her way from poverty to become one of the most feared executives in the city. She was 51 years old, with sharp cheekbones, platinum blonde haircut in a severe bob, and eyes that could freeze a person mid-sentence. She wore power like perfume, and everyone who entered her presence felt small, insignificant, reduced to nothing more than a number on a spreadsheet. Today was the annual company review, where employees from every department gathered in the grand boardroom to present their work and pray they survived her judgment. Today was also the day that Diane Crawford would learn the most important lesson of her life. This is the story of how a female CEO mocked black single dad's silence, then realized why, and how that moment changed lives forever. Terrence Williams sat in the back row of the boardroom, his hands clasped tightly together on his lap. He was 37 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with deep brown skin and eyes that held a gentleness that seemed almost out of place in this cold corporate world. He worked as a data analyst on the 22nd floor, a job he had held for 3 years. He was good at it, excellent even, but he kept to himself. He never spoke up in meetings. He never joined the office happy hours. He never made small talk by the coffee machine. People called him quiet. Some called him strange. A few whispered that he was unfriendly, that he thought he was better than everyone else. None of them knew the truth. None of them knew that Terrence went home every night to a small apartment where his 8-year-old son Isaiah waited for him, sitting by the window, watching for his father's car. None of them knew that Isaiah had not spoken a single word in 3 years, not since the accident that took his mother's life. None of them knew that Terrence had learned to be silent because his son needed him to understand a world without words. The boardroom filled quickly, chairs scraping against the floor as 50 employees arranged themselves in neat rows. The massive oak table at the front of the room was reserved for Diane and her executive team, a collection of stern-faced men and women in expensive suits who looked like they had never laughed a day in their lives. Terrence kept his eyes on the floor, avoiding eye contact with anyone. He had been dreading this day for weeks. His supervisor had informed him that he would need to present his department's quarterly data directly to Diane Crawford. The thought made his stomach churn with anxiety. He was not afraid of the numbers. He knew them by heart, every statistic, every trend, every projection. He was afraid of speaking. He was afraid of standing in front of all these people and using his voice when his son could not use his own. It felt wrong, somehow. It felt like a betrayal. For 3 years, Terrence had communicated with Isaiah through sign language, through written notes, through gentle touches and patient silences. He had learned that words were not the only way to express love, that sometimes the deepest connections happened in the spaces between sounds. But here, in this world of presentations and pitches and people who measured worth by the volume of your voice, his silence was seen as weakness. Diane Crawford entered the room precisely at 9 o'clock, her heels clicking against the marble like a metronome of authority. The conversations died immediately, swallowed by the fear that followed her like a shadow. She took her seat at the head of the table and surveyed the room with those cold blue eyes, searching for targets, looking for weakness. Her assistant handed her a tablet containing the day's agenda, and she scrolled through it with a bored expression. "Let's get this over with," she announced, her voice sharp and impatient. "I have a lunch meeting at noon, and I refuse to let mediocrity make me late." The first presenter stood nervously, a young woman from marketing who stumbled over her words and lost her place twice. Diane interrupted her constantly, picking apart her data with surgical precision, humiliating her in front of the entire company. The woman left the podium with tears in her eyes. The second presenter fared slightly better, but still received a tongue lashing that made everyone in the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. By the time Terrence's name was called, the atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. People were holding their breath, praying not to be noticed, desperate to escape Diane's wrath. Terrence stood slowly, his legs feeling heavy, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. He walked to the front of the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence, and connected his laptop to the presentation screen. The data appeared on the screen behind him, charts and graphs and numbers that told the story of his department's work over the past 3 months. Terrence knew this information inside and out. He had spent countless nights working on it after Isaiah fell asleep, double-checking every calculation, making sure everything was perfect. But, as he stood before the crowd, as he opened his mouth to speak, the words caught in his throat like stones. He thought of Isaiah sitting in that hospital bed 3 years ago, his small body bruised from the car accident, his eyes wide with shock as the doctors told him his mother was gone. He thought of the moment when Isaiah stopped speaking, when the silence became his shield against a world that had hurt him too deeply. He thought of all the therapy sessions, the specialists, the nights when Isaiah cried without making a sound, his tears the only voice he had left. How could Terrence stand here and speak when his son could not? How could he use words so casually when Isaiah fought every single day just to exist in a world that demanded constant noise? The silence stretched on. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. People began to shift in their seats. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through grass. Diane Crawford leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with annoyance and something that looked like cruel anticipation. "Mr. Williams," Diane said, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "I was under the impression that you were here to present data, not to stand there like a mannequin. Do you have something wrong with you? Or are you simply wasting everyone's time?" Terrence's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. He looked at the screen behind him, at the numbers that represented months of hard work, and he felt the words building in his chest, fighting to get out. But every time he tried to speak, he saw Isaiah's face, heard the doctor's voice, felt the crushing weight of grief that had never fully lifted. "This is absolutely ridiculous," Diane continued, standing up from her chair. She walked around the table, her heels clicking with each step, until she stood directly in front of Terrence. She was shorter than him by nearly a foot, but her presence made her seem like a giant. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, Mr. Williams, but let me make something very clear. Silence is not acceptable in my company. Silence tells me that you have nothing to contribute. Silence tells me that you are taking up space that could be filled by someone with actual value." She turned to face the crowd, gesturing dramatically toward Terrence if he were an exhibit in a museum of failure. "Look at this, everyone. This is what happens when we lower our standards. This is what happens when we hire people who cannot even manage basic professional communication. A man who cannot speak has no place in the business world. He has no place in my company." The words hung in the air like poison. Terrence felt the heat rising in his face, felt the anger building in his chest, but he remained still. He had learned long ago that anger solved nothing. He had learned that from Isaiah, from watching his son struggle through grief without ever lashing out, without ever blaming anyone for the unfairness of his loss. Diane was not finished. She circled Terrence like a predator sizing up its prey, her voice growing louder with each word. "What's the matter, Mr. Williams? Cat got your tongue? Or perhaps you simply don't have anything intelligent to say. I've heard rumors about you, you know. People say you're strange. They say you keep to yourself, that you never talk to anyone. Well, now I understand why. You're completely useless. You can't even defend yourself when someone criticizes you to your face." She stopped directly in front of him, tilting her head up to meet his eyes with a cold smile. "Let me give you some advice. In this world, the silent get trampled, the weak get destroyed. If you can't find your voice, then you don't deserve to be here." Terrence looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time, he saw something beneath the cruelty. He saw fear. He saw loneliness. He saw a woman who had built walls so high around herself that she had forgotten what it felt like to be human. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. The anger faded, replaced by something that felt almost like pity. He reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers moved across the screen, pulling up a video that he had watched 1,000 times, a video that he had never shown anyone outside his family. Without a word, he turned the phone toward Diane and pressed play. The video showed a small boy sitting at a kitchen table, his hands moving rapidly through the air. He was signing, his face alight with concentration and joy as he communicated with someone off-screen. Then the camera shifted, revealing Terrence sitting across from him, signing back with a gentle smile. The two of them were having a conversation without speaking a single word, their hands dancing through the air like birds, their connection visible in every gesture. After a moment, the boy reached across the table and hugged Terrence tightly, burying his face against his father's chest. A message appeared at the bottom of the video. Isaiah Williams, age 8, selective mutism following trauma, communicates exclusively through sign language. Diane watched the video, her face frozen in an expression that nobody had ever seen on her before. The cruelty drained away, replaced by something raw and unguarded. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the phone. The entire room was silent, everyone watching this powerful woman as she confronted something that her money and status could not control. When the video ended, she handed the phone back to Terrence without a word. For a long moment, she simply stood there, staring at him, her mouth slightly open, her eyes glistening with what might have been tears. "Mr. Williams," Diane said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, "your son. He cannot speak." Terrence shook his head slowly. He raised his hands and began to sign, his movements fluid and graceful, telling a story without words. Then, for the first time in the meeting, he spoke. His voice was soft, rough from disuse, but steady. "My wife died 3 years ago in a car accident." Isaiah was in the back seat. He watched her die. He hasn't spoken since. The words fell into the silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that touched everyone in the room. Diane took a step backward, her hand rising to her chest as if she had been physically struck. "I learned to be silent because my son needed me to understand his world." Terrence continued, his voice growing stronger. "I learned that words are not the only way to communicate. I learned that sometimes the most powerful things we say are the things we never speak out loud. My son taught me that love doesn't need a voice. My son taught me that presence matters more than words. My son taught me that true strength is not about how loudly you can shout, but about how deeply you can listen." He paused, looking directly at Diane with eyes that held no anger, only a profound sadness. "You asked what's wrong with me. Nothing is wrong with me, Miss Crawford. I am a father who loves his son. I am a man who has learned that silence is not weakness. It is understanding. It is patience. It is love made visible without sound." The boardroom remained frozen in stunned silence. Diane Crawford stood before Terrence, her carefully constructed armor crumbling piece by piece. Nobody had ever seen her like this, vulnerable and exposed, stripped of the cruelty that had defined her for so long. She opened her mouth to speak, closed it again, then turned away, walking toward the windows that overlooked the city. For a full minute, she stood there with her back to the room, her shoulders shaking slightly. When she finally turned around, tears were streaming down her face, cutting rivers through her expensive makeup. "When I was 12 years old," she began, her voice cracking with emotion, "my younger brother Michael stopped speaking. He was 7. Our father was not a kind man. Michael retreated into silence to protect himself from the violence in our home. I used to hold him at night while he cried without making a sound. I used to sign to him because it was the only way he would communicate with me." She paused, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "Michael took his own life when he was 15. He left a note that said he was tired of living in a world that didn't want to listen to him. He said that everyone was always so busy talking that nobody ever noticed he was drowning." The confession hit the room like a thunderclap. People gasped, chairs scraped, hands flew to mouths. Diane Crawford, the Ice Queen, the merciless CEO, had just revealed a pain she had buried for nearly 40 years. "I built all of this," Diane continued, gesturing around the room, "because I thought that if I was powerful enough, if I was loud enough, if I was successful enough, then I could drown out the silence that haunted me. I thought that if I never stopped talking, never stopped pushing, never stopped fighting, then I wouldn't have to remember my brother's face. I wouldn't have to remember how I failed him. She walked slowly toward Terrence, her steps uncertain, her usual confidence completely gone. I became the thing I hated most. I became the person who doesn't listen. I became the person who tramples the silent instead of protecting them. She stopped in front of him, looking up into his eyes with an expression of genuine remorse. Mr. Williams, I am so sorry. For everything I said. For everything I assumed. For judging you without knowing your story. Terrence looked at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he raised his hands and began to sign. The movements were graceful, deliberate, filled with meaning that transcended language. When he finished, he translated for those who could not understand. I said, "Forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves. Your brother's silence was his truth. My son's silence is his truth. And your pain is your truth. We all carry burdens that others cannot see. The question is not whether we fall, but whether we choose to rise." Diane broke down completely. She covered her face with her hands and sobbed, 38 years of grief and guilt pouring out of her in waves. Several employees stood uncertainly, not knowing what to do, never having witnessed anything like this. Terrence stepped forward and did something that shocked everyone in the room. He placed a gentle hand on Diane's shoulder and stood beside her in silence, offering comfort without words, presence without pressure. After several minutes, Diane composed herself enough to speak again. She straightened her jacket, wiped her eyes, and turned to face the entire room. "I owe all of you an apology," she said, her voice raw but determined. "For years, I have ruled this company through fear and intimidation. I have torn people down instead of building them up. I have valued noise over substance, aggression over compassion. That ends today." She looked at Terrence with something like gratitude shining in her eyes. "Mr. Williams has reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago, that the measure of a person is not in how loudly they speak, but in how deeply they care. That strength can be silent, that love can be wordless, that sometimes the most important stories are the ones we never hear because we're too busy shouting to listen." In the weeks that followed, Monarch Industries underwent a transformation that nobody could have predicted. Diane created a new initiative called the Listening Project, dedicated to supporting employees dealing with grief, trauma, and mental health challenges. She invited experts in sign language to teach classes for anyone who wanted to learn. She established scholarships in her brother Michael's name for children with selective mutism and other communication differences. And she formed an unlikely friendship with Terrence Williams, meeting with him weekly to learn about his son Isaiah and to heal the wounds she had carried for so long. 3 months later, Diane attended a small gathering at Terrence's apartment. Isaiah had made a breakthrough in therapy, and his doctors believed he might soon attempt to speak again. The room was filled with people who loved him, his grandmother, his therapist, a few close friends, and now Diane Crawford. When Isaiah walked into the room and saw everyone waiting for him, he froze. For a moment, fear flickered in his eyes. Then he looked at his father, who signed gently, "You are brave. You are loved. Whatever you choose is enough." Isaiah nodded slowly. He looked around the room, taking in each face. Then, in a voice rusty from years of silence, barely louder than a whisper, he spoke his first words in 3 years. "Thank you," he said, "for listening." The room erupted in tears and laughter and joy. Terrence swept his son into his arms, holding him tight, crying openly without shame. Diane stood in the corner, watching the scene with tears streaming down her face, feeling for the first time in decades that perhaps she had finally done something meaningful with her life. The story of how a female CEO mocked black single dad's silence, then realized why spread far beyond Monarch Industries. It became a reminder that everyone carries invisible battles, that judgment without understanding is cruelty, and that sometimes the most powerful voices are the ones that never make a sound. Terrence continued to teach his colleagues sign language, building bridges between worlds that had never connected before. Diane became an advocate for mental health awareness, speaking at conferences about her brother Michael and the importance of creating spaces where silence is respected rather than punished. And Isaiah, the little boy who had retreated into wordlessness to survive, slowly began to find his way back to language, one word at a time, surrounded by people who had learned that listening is the greatest gift we can give each other. The true measure of our humanity is not found in the words we speak, but in the patience with which we wait for others to find their own voice.